Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session. I say good morning here, but I'm not sure where you are there. But welcome anyway. Tim Baker's my name, and I'm going to spend about 30 minutes with you today talking about this idea of cultivating a learning culture in your team, which I think is one of the key attributes of a high-performing team. So I select 8 key attributes of a high-performing team. And one of those is to create this learning culture so that teams are always continually reinventing themselves. They're looking at new, better and faster, easier, safer ways of doing their work. So we'll look at this topic today. And of course, we're all living in a busy world. And because we're living in a busy world, often these sorts of things are left off the agenda or we don't get time to deal with them. So I want to talk about some ways that we might be able to do that more effectively today. Now, I'll be sending you a copy of the recording and the slides at the end of the presentation, so you'll get those at some stage today. And of course, if you've got questions or anything that you'd like to ask me, the best way to do that is to send me an email at the end of this presentation. So let's launch into it, and I'll share my screen, and we'll get started. All right, those of you who don't know me, just so a quick introduction, if I may, and you can see that I do platform speaking or what we might call keynote addresses. I'm an author. I've now just finished my 13th book, and of course, one of the books that I'm referring to today is Winning Teams, the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. And of course, I also run workshops and coach, executive coaching. So I kept myself pretty busy. So that's a bit about me. Now, the book that I have written, which has only just been released, Winning Teams, has been endorsed by a number of sporting identities. I actually use the All Blacks as an exemplar of a high-performing team. And as an Australian, I was always, and still am, sick of being beaten by the All Blacks year in, year out. So I kind of thought they must be doing something very effective. Obviously, they've got good players, but I think it's a lot more than that. They have something in the order of a 90% strike rate in terms of victories, which is a pretty impressive result. And I thought they must be doing something in terms of those characteristics of high-performing teams. And you can see there are a couple of endorsements from key players, both in New Zealand itself and also in Australia, and the Commissioner of Police here in Queensland, Katarina Carroll. And Nick Farr-Jones, who had something very nice to say about my book. And of course, Nick Farr-Jones led the Australian team to a World Cup victory many years ago. So obviously at that stage, they had many of the characteristics of high-performing teams. Okay, so let's launch into what we're going to be covering. Now, what you can see in front of you now is that around the outside of the model that I incorporate in the book, you can see there are the 8 characteristics. So you can see there's building trust, sharing leadership, being agile, creating purpose, managing stakeholders, improving systems, utilizing diversity, and finally learning continuously, which is the one that we're going to concentrate on today in our short time together. So if I go through in great detail all of these characteristics. Not only do I go into them in great detail, I use some anecdotes from sporting teams. I also give you some very practical things that you can do as a team leader to improve your team capability. Now, there's good and bad news with this model. The bad news is there's lots of balls in the air, isn't there? You've got 8 characteristics. The question is, where do you start? The good news is start anywhere you like, because if you can improve one of those characteristics, it'll permeate into other characteristics, and that's the good news. So, for example, if you build higher levels of trust in your team, it's likely that you will have a better opportunity to share the baton of leadership. So the good news is you don't need to deal with all 8 at once. You can deal with one, and what will happen is it will actually contribute to other characteristics as well. All right, so we'll concentrate today, of course, on learning continuously. And I think one of the big objections that I hear time in and time out when I'm talking to managers and team leaders is, how do I find the time in my busy schedule to devote time to continuous improvement? That's a fair question, of course, because we're all time poor. And what I'm hoping to do here is to demonstrate to you in our very short time together that really you don't need a huge amount of time to create a culture of continuous improvement. And I'm very conscious of that objection, which is very real. But I would also counter that by saying that I think it's a myth to suggest that it takes a long time. So we'll go through a couple of characteristics and ways and means of doing that in our short time together. Okay, so what I wanted to do is talk about 3 concepts, basically, today. I wanted to talk about where you could start with your continuous improvement and who is involved. So where do we start and who should be involved? Because that's often a dilemma as well, because you're probably doing many, many things with your team. So the question is, where do you start this process? So let's have a look at some ideas around that. And of course, what might be the process that you might use in order to create a continuous improving culture in your team? And when ideas come up, and of course they should come up, you have to assess them, and not every idea that comes up is feasible. So we actually have to have some process of assessing ideas about how we might improve what we're actually doing. So they're the 3 concepts that I want to cover today. And of course, you can read more about it in my book. So let's start with that very first question. Where do I start? Now, I suggest to you, and of course, when we talk about continuous improvement in a team, we're often thinking about innovation and so forth. But in my view, the best place to start is on the mandatory team activities that chew up a lot of your time with little results. So if you think about the business that you're in, whether it's producing a service or whether it's producing a product or both, whether it's an internal service provider or deals directly with clients and customers, the first thing you need to think about is, what business am I in? And once you've established what business you're in, then the key thing is to work out, well, where do we spend the majority of our time? So, for example, you might spend a majority of your time writing reports. Now, if most of your team members spend the majority of their time writing reports, well, guess what? That's the place to start. That's the place to start, because by getting a small improvement in a large activity that you're involved in your team, a small improvement will make a massive difference. So I would suggest to you to start where you do the bulk of your activity. So if it's compliance, then we start with compliance. If it's teaching or training or learning or those sorts of activities, that's the place to start. And then, of course, we have to actually ask ourselves the question, what systems can be changed? Now, the other thing I would say to you is that there are some systems that can be eliminated. I don't think we'd ever be, in most cases at least, unless you're an IT startup firm, most organizations and teams have too many systems. It's not a case of not having enough. So the question is, are the systems actually serving you well? So once you've identified the activity, the next step you must look at is what systems underpin or support that activity. And that's where we can start. And then, of course, the third question is, what might make a difference? So you've actually got to look at the amount of effort put in to give the amount of results that you're looking for. So obviously, if you put in a small amount of effort and get a major result, then clearly that's a good place to start. On the other hand, if you've got to put in a massive amount of effort and perhaps even it's costing you money and time, and it's only going to get you minimal results, then that probably wouldn't be a good area. And I think the best place, the best concept to guide us there is the Pareto principle, or what we might refer to as the 80-20 rule or the 20-80 rule. And that is, we should be looking for things where if we put in 20% of the effort, we'll get an 80% return. And that's critically important. So if you're in a customer focused area, whether it's internal or external, and by doing something which may not take a huge amount of time, and that makes a massive result at the other end, then that might be a good place to start. So that's the first key challenge for you. Where do I start? Now, once we've worked that out, it is absolutely critical that you get your team involved in these discussions. Many of your team members may well think that it's your job to come up with these improvements. It's your job to do that. Well, I suppose in a sense it is, in the terms of the overview of your team. But if you don't get your team involved, then there's no skin in the game. They don't feel a sense of obligation. They don't feel a sense of involvement. So it's really important that you take the team on the journey of continuous learning. So it's extremely important to do this as a team and not just you sitting in an office trying to work this out for yourself. And I can tell you, and you should know, that by involving other people, it does ignite an old myth, or sorry, not an old myth, an old concept that people don't argue with their own data. If people have actually given a contribution and you consider it worthwhile and you've assessed it and it's worthwhile, then the team will be more committed to that because they themselves have been involved in the change, rather than it's just come from you and you've imposed it on the team. So I think the important thing is use your team meetings. And, you know, what I always suggest with team meetings is try to make them 50% reporting, 50% discussion. So I think it'd be fair to say that a meeting could be devoted to the normal work in progress type reporting that you would normally do, but shorten that and then include a discussion at the end, even if it's only 20 minutes, on areas for improvement and continuous learning. And by getting your team involved, they start to realize that it's not just your job to do this. They have a responsibility as well. Now, this is a key plank in this. Now, there's a trade-off here, obviously. If you get your team involved, it will take a little more time, because obviously you've got to listen to the views and perspectives that people have, and they don't always agree. And so that does take time. However, the problem of not involving team members is that they then do not feel any great sense of commitment to whatever it is that you've decided needs changing, irrespective of how logical it might seem. So a key plank is get your team involved, and I'll talk about how you can do that shortly. Now, the process that you could use, coming to the second question that we wanted to look at here, is let's have a look. It's a fairly straightforward process, but it's one that a lot of teams, in my experience, don't actually apply. The first thing you've got to do is you've got to create the time and space to examine your systems. Now, if you don't create the time and space to examine your systems, you may think it's a great idea what I'm talking about, but the fact is a little time, a window of opportunity will not present itself. So you have to actually devote time and energy to the process of continuous learning. Now, as I said earlier, one of the most efficient ways of doing this is to reduce your reporting processes so that you get your team involved in a discussion around things that can be improved within your team. So that would be the most efficient way. You could, of course, organize extra meetings for that and for that issue alone, but you might as well tack it onto your normal work in progress meeting. And I think if you do that, then you don't actually need to spend more time. All you need to do is just to reduce the reporting processes to a minimal amount of time where you're still getting the feedback and information that you need, but then to be able to apply the rest of the time, the balance of the time in that meeting, to actually looking at where you might make these changes. And then once you've done that, so once you've carved out an opportunity, then you need to initiate a conversation with your team members about how systems can be improved. So you need to start that conversation, and it's no good, of course, just walking in and saying, okay, what system should we improve? I think if you do that, you may find that you don't get much back. So you actually have to start the process, and I'll talk about how you do that in a moment. The other thing I'd strongly recommend once you've got your team in the room is that you involve everyone in that conversation. Now, we all know that there are some people who like to talk in teams, and there are other people who don't like to talk. This is just normal in any team environment, or any group of people for that matter, that come together. So what I strongly recommend you do is basically make sure that you don't have one or two people dominating these discussions. And the way to do that, of course, is to paraphrase them. So for the people that are very verbose in your team meetings, as soon as they draw breath, summarize what they've said or paraphrase what they've said so that you can move on. And the other side's very important, and those that are sitting there quietly in the meeting, not saying anything, there's nothing wrong with you asking them. So I might say, Jill, have you got a perspective on this that you'd like to share, because we haven't heard from you yet? And I don't think team leaders do that enough. And of course, Jill could sit there very comfortably and say nothing during the duration of this meeting because she's not being called upon. So if you call upon people, they may, of course, say, I've got nothing to add, but at least you're sending a very clear signal that you want everybody engaged in this process. So other quiet people in the team might see you talking to Jill and start think, well, maybe I need to say something here because, you know, so-and-so might call on me. So it's important to get everybody engaged. So that's the sort of rough process that you might look at. Now, one of the most powerful forms, one of the most powerful ways, I think, that's hugely underrated is the after-action review. So if you're working in a project-based environment and you've just completed projects, and the definition of a project is there's a finite start and finish, what I strongly recommend that you do is that before launching into the next project, and when you've got everybody in the room, ask them these three simple questions. And by doing this, you are engaging them in the process of continuous improvement, whether they realize it or not. So the very first question we ask is, what did we do well? So what did we as a team, if it's a team effort, what did we do well in this project? Now, even if it's an absolute disaster, there's always something that went well. So concentrate on creating the upward spiral of positivity to start with. And then, of course, once you have exhausted what went well, move on to the question, which is the second question, what was not done well? Now, even if it was a wonderful project achievement, there's always things that can be improved. So by asking these first two questions, what we're doing is we're opening up the discussion of evaluation around a particular project. Now, once we've answered those two questions, and what I would say to you is that this process need not take longer than 20 to 25 minutes. So, but I don't think you should just skip over any of these questions. From my experience, the one that people have trouble with is the first one. What did we do well? Because most people have got a negative mindset. And I think it's very easy for people to pick holes in what happened, but not so easy sometimes for people to talk about what went well. Set some rules of engagement, if you like. This is not a finger pointing exercise. This isn't an exercise in, embarrassing anybody, but talk in general terms. The last question is the real question where the rubber meets the road, and that is, what will we do differently next time? So if another project of a similar variety turns up, and of course, you know your work better than I do, what can we do differently next time? So, because what you're doing by doing this at the end of the project is fresh in everybody's mind. So they're able to respond to it. They probably had skin in the game, so there's an emotional attachment. And I guess thirdly, you can do this in a very short space of time and come up with some really good recommendations. Now it's up to you, I think, as the team leader, to make sure that whatever comes out of these three questions, the after action review, is actually adhered to. I think it's very important that that happens. So listen to what people have to say. And of course, if you have to get together with an individual or two or three at the end of the meeting to nut out exactly how we might go about differently, please do so. So I think that often the after action review is used as a box ticking exercise. It's used as a quality assurance exercise. And I don't think that's a very effective way to use it, because we kind of just give it lip service, and it's almost as if it's another thing we have to get off the list. So I think we should use it in a more proactive way when we complete our projects and our work. So that's important. And just to underline how incredibly powerful this tool is, Peter Senge, who's a guru in organizational development, he's been around for about 25 years, had this to say about the after action review. I'll just read it through because I think it's important we understand that this is a very powerful tool we've got at our disposal. The Army's after action review is arguably one of the most successful organizational learning methods ever devised. Yet most every corporate effort to graft this truly innovative practice into their culture has failed because, again and again, people reduce the living practice of the AAR to a sterile technique, in other words, a quality assurance technique. Now, if Peter Senge says this is the greatest tool for organizational learning ever devised, then that's high praise indeed, and I think we should listen to that. So it's very, very simple to keep those questions in mind. What went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently? Now, of course, you can do this one-on-one as well. You don't have to have the team meeting there. If one person's been doing a challenging project and they've finished and you bail them up in the corridor, it's perfectly reasonable for you to ask them those three questions. And of course, there's individual learning that goes on with that as well. Now, let's look at some things, some parameters, if you like, around where you know some of the key improvement questions that you might like to consider. Now, bear in mind, I don't know your industry. You know it very well. So some of these will be applicable and some of them may not. I've tried to make them as generic as I can, but let's go through them and just consider these questions. And these are the questions that you can ask. So if you've got your group together and your team is there and you're going through some continuous learning areas of opportunity, some good opening questions that you could ask are these. How can this process be done quicker? Now, when I say this process be done quicker, you could also add to that without sacrificing, its rigor. So, doing something quicker, of course, can be done, but it can be done in a very sloppy way. So you want to continue to make sure that the rigor is in the system, but you want to be able to do it quicker. Now, why is it important to do it quicker? Because it's probably likely that somebody's wanting to receive whatever it is that you generate in your team. And the faster you can do something without sacrificing quality, the better. Now, that's definitely an area to look at. Now, if that doesn't resonate, how about we try the next question? How can this process be done more accurately? All right, so if we're in the business of writing reports and there are numerous mistakes and inaccuracies in the reporting process, what can we do to make sure that our reports are spot on and accurate? Now, I don't know the answer to that specifically, but certainly it's a good question to ask. So accuracy is critically important to business success and team success. So what can we do to be more accurate? The third question you might like to ask is, how can this activity be done in a more timely manner, in a timelier manner. In other words, how can we make sure that we meet the deadlines required? And how can we make sure that we meet the requirements that other people, so for example, if you're an internal service provider, it's likely that you're providing information and services to people within your organization. And of course, part of how efficient your team is whether you can do this in a timely fashion. And of course, we're all busy. We've all got many, many balls in the air. We're juggling it at once. So how can we actually do this in a more timely manner? That's another question that you can ask. Another question you can ask is, how can this procedure be carried out more cost effectively? How can we reduce the time or cost of doing something? Because clearly those things do have a bearing on budgets and all the rest of it. And finally, how can this task be done with greater productivity? So there are 5 questions that you can ask to prompt your team to think differently. And of course, if you refer these questions to a specific body of work that has been completed by the team, it'll make it even more effective. So persevere with that and try those questions. Now, when you're assessing an idea, there are really 3 key elements to it. So because everything that comes up in these team meetings may not be applicable. I mean, they may not be practical. They may not be, you can't implement them. Now, the good news is that your team members know that. So they're not expecting that everything that they volunteer in the team meeting will be put into practice. So there's 3 key things that you need to think about. How much time will it take? Because obviously if it takes a lot of time, you'd want to get a serious benefit out of it if it's going to take time. How complex is it to implement? So if we've got to, overhaul our customer relationship system or whatever it is that we're using, complexity has to be a key element. And obviously the more complex a change is, the greater the return on investment needs to be guaranteed. And what might be the cost? And the way to look at cost is not just in terms of dollars, but also in terms of time. So if we're implementing a new system in our team and it's going to require all of our team members to down tools for a couple of hours a day, then that's a cost. It's a cost that may not be in the budget, but it's certainly going to be a cost because those people can't deal with other issues that they may well be paid to do. So we need to do that. So it's a nice rational way of looking at it. What's the cost? What's the complexity? And what's the time it's going to take? And I think you could also get your team involved in that discussion as well. So that works extremely well. Now, that brings us pretty much to the end. And some of you may not be aware that I run one of these short webinars every Friday at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And you're more than welcome to attend. Now, I'm going on holidays at the end of today. So our next session will be on the 14th of January at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to look at the ingredients of effective feedback. And that comes from my latest book, which will be published next year, on mastering feedback, a practical guide for better leadership conversations. If you'd like to register for that, as you did for today, there's the link. And when you get the slides, you'll get that link as well. So I'm just letting you know that these things do go on every day, every week, except for my 3 weeks of well-earned rest. And many of you would be having a break, I'm sure, over this festive season as well. And finally, I've got a special offer for you. If you'd like to purchase my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams, you'll find if you Google it, you'll probably be paying around $40. But if you send me an email by the close of business today, I will make sure that you get a coupon, and the coupon will allow you to access that book for virtually half the price, which I think is a great deal. But you need to be on the ball and send me an email immediately, and I will make sure that I get that happening before I go on leave today. All right. So, folks, I'll just stop sharing for a moment. Thank you for the opportunity of working with you. And if this is your first time, I'd encourage you to come back because I do cover some very practical, easy to implement tools for leaders in a whole range of areas that goes on every week. So thank you for the opportunity of working with you if I have worked with you in the past. And I would like to wish you all a wonderful festive season. Be safe. And thank you, Craig. That's a nice that's a nice comment. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you too, Craig, for your wonderful support in these webinars that I run. So I look forward to catching up with you next year. And keep your eyes peeled because very soon in your inbox, you'll get a copy of the slides and the recording. So thanks, everyone. All the best. And we'll catch you next year. Thank you and goodbye.